So thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to open a conference on Saud Wannous, probably the most important Arab playwright of the 20th century. Committed to building a better world based on freedom, democracy, and social justice, Wannous conceived of theater as a public forum that would make it possible for people to critically engage with socio-political, intellectual, and cultural debates. He was one of the first in his generation to call for politicizing theater, for introducing change from within and through cultural production. Confronted with political setbacks and increasing despair, especially as a result of the Arab defeats of the June 1967 war and the Gulf War of 1991, he did not give up hope, but spoke out against Israeli occupation and Arab dictatorships alike, embracing humanist beliefs, as a number of the papers in our conference will show. Shortly before his death in 1997, he self-critically admitted that his generation did not achieve the ideals of democracy and human rights it was looking for. Placing his hope in the future generation, he coined the today often cited sentence, "We are condemned to hope." In light of the political change sweeping the region today, the Syrian uprising in particular, Wannous has gained in importance as a playwright and a public intellectual. In part as a follow-up to the recent performance of Wannous' play, The Rape, Al-Ightisab, produced by AUB and my colleague Robert Myers, directed by Saha Asaf and translated by Nada Saab, who's also one of our speakers, and Robert Myers, our conference wants to pay tribute to Wannous. It also aims to encourage further research on Wannous and to set the grounds for a publication on Wannous in English. The conference consists of two parts, two panels that bring together scholars, writers, and theater artists from Lebanon, Syria, Germany, and the US, who explore different aspects of Wannous' life and work, as well as his impact on a younger generation of artists. We end the conference with a screening of There's So Many Things Still to Say, a documentary about Wannous directed by the late Syrian filmmaker Omar Amiralai that was shot shortly before Wannous' death. And the screening will take place not here, but in Basish Auditorium in West Hall at 6 p.m. And please try to make it. It's really an excellent film that sheds light on Wannous, but also really on the modern history of the region, in particular the impact of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the region at large. We would like to thank everyone involved in making this conference possible. First and foremost, the participants, Dima Wannous, Friederike Panevik, Elias Khouri, Nada Saab, Muhammad El-Attar, Edward Sita, and Saha Asaf, who's also co-organizer together with Robert and myself. In addition, we thank Rolaba Al-Baki, who kindly helped us with translating a couple of the talks from Arabic into English, and will read those out after the speakers. And we would like to thank our graduate assistant, Razan Farhat, and our administrative assistant, Marwa Al-Rose Ramadan, as well as our technical assistant, Yusuf Tome. We extend our thanks to the Office of the Dean at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Center for Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies, and the Center for American Studies and Research, and the English Department at AUB for their generous support. Last but not least, we would like to thank Wannous' family, his widow and daughter, for their trust and generosity. We are very happy and honored to have them with us today. We in particular thank Dima Wannous for opening our conference with a personal note on her father. So,
سونيا، أول شيء بدي أشكرك كتير، بدي أشكر سحر وروبرت وندى على هذا اليوم اللي فعلا كتير يعني أنا فرحانة فيه. وماما بعيدة، ليه بعيدة؟
Shukran, Dima, let me briefly introduce you, also say a few words about you. So Dima Wannous is a journalist and a writer. She studied French literature and translation at the University of Damascus and the Sorbonne in Paris. She writes on cultural and political topics for a number of Arab and foreign newspapers, and has also worked in media broadcast, both radio and television. She has published a collection of short stories entitled Tafasil, Details, which were translated into English and German, and a novel called Kursi, Chair. In 2009, she was awarded the Beirut 39 Prize for Young Writers. So please, Dima, the floor is all yours.
كتير سونيا. وقت طلبت مني سونيا أكتب هذا النص طبعا يعني وافقت بسعادة، بس لما قعدت بدي أكتبه حسيت بعبء كتير كبير، لأنه شو صعب الواحد يختصر 15 سنة بكم ورقة كم صفحة كلمات، صعب فعلا. وأنا بحب الفصحى كتير، ما بحب يعني اكتب بالعامية، حتى على الفيسبوك بستصعب اكتب بالعامية، ومع ذلك هي أول مرة بحس بعبء الفصحى وأنا عم بكتب عن هي المشاعر، فهذا اللي خطر لي أقوله. أعبر أمام غرفة المكتب، البيت يملأه السكون، صمت قاتم وطويل يقطعه بابا بكلمات قليلة وعبارات تخرج من فمه بطيئة مترددة، وغنوة تكتب تلك الكلمات البطيئة والمترددة، ثم يطلب منها أن تمحو العبارة ليعيد صياغتها من جديد. غنوة معماري كانت تأتي كل يوم من الساعة 4 بعد الظهر حتى 8 أو 9 أو 10 أحيانا، وأنا كنت أتساءل لماذا يصر والدي على حضور غنوة كل يوم، لماذا يصر على الكتابة مع أنه لا يعرف أن يكتب، بالكاد يكتب عبارة واحدة كل يوم وقد يمحوها في نهاية الأمر. 10 من عمري أجبرني على القراءة، بدأت بنجيب محفوظ وطه حسين والياس خوري، ثم تشيخوف ودوستويفسكي، ثم ألبير كامي وماركيز وكونديرا. لم يطلب مني يوما أن أقرأ مسرحياته، ولم أفعل أنا أيضا حتى رحيله، باستثناء كتاب واحد سردي عن تجربة قاسية عشناها كلنا، عن الذاكرة والموت، كتاب فيه مجموعة من القصص إلى جانب يومياته في المستشفى خلال الأيام التي تعرض فيها لصدمة إنتانية وكاد أن يرحل عنا ذلك الحين. وأنا كنت أتقصد عدم قراءة مسرحياته، ربما لأنني لم أكن أتخيل أن لأبي مهنة أخرى في الحياة غير قضاء الوقت بصحبتي. وبالفعل قضينا معظم سنواته الأخيرة سوية، نتنقل بين غرفة النوم حيث يتمدد كثيرا من الوقت وبين الصالون حيث نشاهد فيلما أو نشرب الشاي، ونتحدث كأسرة صغيرة مكونة من 3 أشخاص لا تنقصها الكآبة ولا الوحشة. لم أكن أتخيل حياتي من دونه، كان الحياة كلها. أدرس برفقته وأحلم بصحبة خياله وألعب معه وأتشاجر وأفكر وأضحك وأبكي، حتى أنه كان يعيد كتابة دروس التاريخ والجغرافيا كلها بلا استثناء لأتمكن من فهمها ثم حفظها عن ظهر قلب. أتذكره يقرأ الدرس الطويل والمضجر ثم يكتب بقلم رصاص ملخصا بكلمات سهلة وعبارات رشيقة نقرأها سوية وأحفظها. كنت أكره القراءة وألهث في محاولة لفظ الكلمات ومخارج الحروف. علمني كيف أخترع الفواصل حتى وإن لم تكن موجودة. علمني ألا ألتزم بنصوص الكتب المدرسية كما هي، ألا أستسلم لتلك الصفحات المحشوة باللغو والمعلومات المكررة. علمني السخرية كي أتخفف من عبء النظام المدرسي الصارم. علمني الصمت، أن أتفرج على ما يدور حولي وأتأمل وأفكر. علمني الجدل الطويل والنقاشات المسهبة التي ربما تودي إلى اقتناعي أو عدمه. لم تكن هنالك بديهيات ولا مسلمات، وأنا الآن وقد صار عندي ابن في 10 من عمره أعرف كم من الجهد بذله والدي ليحتمل كل تلك النقاشات. ثمة موضوع واحد فقط لم يكن يحتمل النقاش به: الله. كان يقول لي ويكرر بلا شرح مستفيض: الله غير موجود. وأذكر كم غضب مني عندما عدت إلى البيت حاملة دفتر العلامات، وكنت قد نلت العلامة التامة في مادة الديانة، بينما علامتي في مادة اللغة العربية كانت متدنية. كان صريحا معي إلى درجة الإنهاك. يقول لي وأنا في 10 من عمري: سأرحل بعد 3 أشهر كما أكد الأطباء في باريس. 3 أشهر تلك امتدت ل4 أعوام، إلا أن كل يوم من تلك الأعوام 4 كان جنازة مؤجلة بالنسبة إلي. كل يوم كان اليوم الأخير، وأي يوم آخر هو يوم إضافي. بابا الذي كان كئيبا إلى حد لا يطاق غيره المرض. بات أكثر تسامحا مع الحياة، أقل قساوة على نفسه. أراد أن يبتلع السنوات ويسرق كل لحظة ممكنة. لم يكن متطلبا في حياته، تكفيه القراءة والكتابة والجلوس بصحبتنا أمي وأنا. راح يكتب بشغف خوفا من أن يباغته الموت. كتب معظم ما حلم بكتابته، ما بدأ التفكير به قبل سنوات طويلة من المرض عندما صمت عن الكتابة. كتب منمنمات تاريخية وطقوس الإشارات والتحولات والأيام المخمورة. وأيضا راح يلهث بعلاقته بي، يختصر السنوات ويعيش معي كل ما يتصوره عن العيش مع ابنة وحيدة حتى تكبر. رحل وكنت في 15، إلا أن روحي كانت في منتصف العشرينات من كثرة ما كانت السنوات الأخيرة غزيرة ومكثفة. تحدثنا في كل الأمور التي لم يحن وقتها بعد. حدثني عن طفولته وعائلته وكرهه لوالده وعشقه لأمه. حدثني في السياسة ورفض انتسابي لحزب البعث مع معرفته أنهم سينسبوني بالغصب ومن دون أن أعرف، لكنه علمني أن آخذ موقفا وأن أواجه وأتمرد. لا وجود للبديهيات. علمني أن أعيش كما أريد وليس كما يريدون لي أن أعيش. حدثني في الجنس وفي الدين وفي المحرمات وفي الحب. كان يؤرقه أنني لم أحب وقد بلغت 12 من عمري. لم يكن يعرف أن أحاديثنا تلك كانت تغنيني عن الحياة، كانت هي الحياة كلها. تعلمت في مدرسة يقصدها أبناء التجار ورجال الأعمال والدبلوماسيين العرب والمسؤولين. أذكر أنني كنت الوحيدة من بنات صفي التي لا يمتلك أهلها سيارة، وأذكر أنني كنت أرى أن عدم امتلاك سيارة هو الأمر الطبيعي وامتلاكها هو الاستثناء. هذا بحد ذاته يشبه السحر بالنسبة إلي. كيف استطاع والدي أن يعلمني ذلك الاكتفاء من دون أن يقوله مباشرة ومن دون أن نتحدث في أمور السيارات وغلائها وكيفية امتلاكها؟ ثم في أيامه الأخيرة عندما سكن مع والدتي في المستشفى، انتقلت أنا للسكن عند قريبته في منطقة المزة. زوجها كان ضابطا، وأنا لم يعد باستطاعتي ركوب باص المدرسة لأنه لا يصل إلى كل الأماكن، فصار سائقهم يقلني بسيارتهم المرسيدس الفارهة إلى المدرسة كل صباح. كنت أصاب بمخص مع الاقتراب من المدرسة، وأروح أرجو السائق أن يتوقف بعيدا من الباب كي لا يراني أحد نازل من تلك السيارة. أخجل وأرتبك وأجهز الكلام الذي سأقوله لمن يراني، أجهز المبررات لفعلتي البشعة تلك. من دون أن أشعر كانت السيارة تعني بالنسبة إلي سلطة سلطة مال أو سلطة نظام، ما البال إن كانت السيارة من نوع مرسيدس. عندما كنا نركب سوية في التاكسي للذهاب إلى قريته في طرطوس أو إلى فندق الشام أو أمية أو مطعم البستان للقاء أصدقائه، كان يجلس بالقرب مني في المقعد الخلفي، وكانت تلك بمثابة إهانة للسائق في سوريا، لأن على الرجال أن يجلسوا إلى جانبه، هكذا تقتضي التقاليد. لم يكن يعرف والدي معنى التقاليد، وكان همه هو السكوت والصامت الذي يختزل كلماته أن يحدثني طوال الطريق مهما كان طويلا. نعم، كان يعرف أنه سيرحل قريبا. نروح نتخيل حيوات الناس الذين نعبر بالقرب من منازلهم، ونلمح الشبابيك مفتوحة وضوء خافت يتدفق منها. ثمة حياة تخفق خلف تلك الشبابيك، يقول لي والدي. ولسائق التاكسي حياة أيضا، وللعابرين في الشارع أمامنا، وللعاملين في المقهى. نلعب بتلك الحيوات ونتخيل ونضحك مع من نجعله يضحك، ونحزن مع الحزانة منهم والفقراء والمغلوب على أمرهم. كان مفتونا بما وراء الشبابيك والجدران، كأنها الحياة التي لم يعشها بعد، إلا أنه يعرف أنها موجودة فيطمئن. قبل أن يرحل بأسابيع قليلة نادى لي وكنت في غرفتي المحاذية لغرفتهما. أباجور الشباك كان مفتوحا، الضوء يملأ الغرفة ويمتد إلى سرير والدي. طلب مني أن أجلس إلى جانبه على السرير وأن أنظر من الشباك إلى امرأة جميلة شعرها طويل تحضن طفلا. نظرت وفتشت ولم أعثر على تلك المرأة. كان يراها في تعرجات زجاج شباك الجيران، كان يتخيل في كل تعرجات الشبابيك التي تطل غرفته عليها أشخاصا وحيوات. خفت يومها وحزنت، كان المرض قد تمكن منه، وأبي يروح يحدق في الفراغ ويعثر فيه على كل ما يحب ويرغب. أرادني أن أكون مصممة أزياء أو مهندسة معمارية، وأرادني أن أكون ما أحب شرط أن أتقنه جيدا. ثم رحل. لم أقل له يوما إنني أحب الكتابة، ولم أتجرأ على البوح بما أحب إلا بعد مرور سنوات طويلة، لأننا في مجتمع يعشق التوريث واستمرار الأهل بأبنائهم ثم بأحفادهم. وكنت على الرغم من حبي للكتابة أكرهها في لحظات كثيرة، خاصة عندما يقال لي ببساطة ومن دون تفكير: ألن تكملي مسيرة والدك؟ ذلك السؤال العقيم الذي لا يخلو من السذاجة كان يطيح بأحلامي ويقف بيني وبين رغبتي في الكتابة، ليس لأن والدي كاتبا بل لأنني أحبها وأستمتع بها. عشت لسنوات تنقلت فيها بين أعمال لا أحبها، إلى أن قررت أنني سأكتب مهما كانت كتابتي سيئة ومخيبة للكثيرين. على الأقل سيفرح أبي أنني كنت ما أريد أن أكون.
Be What You Want to Be by Wannous. I walk past the study. Silence fills the house. A dark and long silence which Baba interrupts with a few words. The words coming out of his mouth slowly and reluctantly. Inwa is writing down those long-drawn and reluctant words. He asks her to erase the words so he can rephrase them. Inwa Ma'amari came daily from 4 till 8, 9, or even 10 p.m. sometimes. I used to ask myself why my father insisted on having Ghinwa come to the house every day. Why he insisted on writing though he did not know how to write. He barely wrote a single phrase every day, and he would sometimes have that erased. When I was 10, he forced me to start reading. I started with Najib Mahfouz and Taha Hussein, then moved to Chekhov and Dostoevsky. I then read Albert Camus, Marquez, and Kundera. He never asked me to read his plays. I never did until his death. Except for that one narrative on a hard experience that we all suffered, Memory and Death, a collection of stories as well as his memoir on his hospital days, during which he suffered a septic shock which almost killed him. It was by intention that I did not read his plays, perhaps because I never imagined that my father had anything else to do in this world besides spending time with me. Indeed, we spent the best part of his last years together, moving between the bedroom where he spent a lot of time lying down, or the living room where we watched TV or drank tea and had, as a family of 3, conversation which were lacking in neither gloom nor desolation. I never imagined life without him. He was life. I studied with him, I dreamed in the company of his imagination, I played with him, we fought, thought, laughed, and wept together. He would even rewrite every one of my history and geography lessons so I could better understand them before committing them to memory. I remember him reading the long and boring lesson and then writing its summary in pencil, using easy words and elegant expressions, which we would then read together before I memorized them. I used to hate reading and struggle over pronouncing words and letters. He taught me how to invent commas, even if they did not exist. He taught me not to bind myself to the content of school texts, not to surrender to those pages rife with nonsense and overused information. He taught me to use sarcasm in order to lighten the heavy load of the rigorous school system. And he taught me how to be silent, how to watch what was going on around me and contemplate and think. He taught me how to engage in lengthy arguments and elaborate discussions which might lead to persuading me or not. The obvious and the postulate had no place. Now that I am the mother of a 10-year-old son, I appreciate the effort he must have exerted to suffer all those discussions. Yet the one topic that he would never tolerate discussing was God. He kept repeating to me, with no elaborate explanation, that God did not exist. I still remember his anger when I returned home with my report card one day, having earned a perfect grade on religion and a low grade on Arabic. He exhausted me with his frankness. He told me when I was 10 that he would die in 3 months as the doctors in Paris had confirmed. Those 3 months stretched into 4 years, each day a procrastinated funeral for me. Every day was the last day, and every another day was an extra day. Baba, who had been intolerably melancholy, was transformed by illness. He became reconciled to life and less harsh on himself. He wanted to wolf down those years and steal every possible moment of life. He was satisfied with reading and writing and being in the company of my mother and me. He started writing fervently, fearing the stealth of death. He wrote everything he had ever dreamed of writing and started planning years before his illness. His writing then became silent. He wrote historical miniatures, rituals of signs and transformations, and drunken days. His relationship with me, his only daughter, took on a pattern characterized by a breathless wish to seize the years, reduce them, and live every moment as he imagined it until I grew up. He died when I was 15. My soul was then in its mid-20s for the abundance and intensity of the last few years. We talked about issues that were not ripe for discussion then. He told me about his childhood and family, and how he hated his father and adored his mother. He talked to me about politics and refused that I join the Ba'ath Party, fully knowing that they would make me join against my will and without my knowledge. But he told me to take a position and confront and rebel. The obvious did not exist. He taught me to live the way I wanted, not how they wanted me to live. We talked about sex, religion, all that is sacred and venerated, and also about love. He was worried that at age 12 I still had not fallen in love. He never knew that those conversations we had made me care less about living my own life. Indeed, they were life itself. I was educated at a school whose students were children of traders, businessmen, Arab diplomats, and men in power. I remember that I was the only student in class whose parents did not own a car. I also remember that I thought then that not owning a car was the normal thing and owning one was the exception. That in itself was magic to me. How did my father manage to instill in me that self-sufficiency without directly talking about it and without our having conversations about cars, their high cost, and the way to acquire them? In his last days, when he and my mother were living at the hospital, I moved in with a relative of his who had a house near the Mazzi area and whose husband was an officer. I was unable to take the school bus since it did not service that area, so the family chauffeur drove me to school every day in a posh Mercedes. I would get stomach cramps when the car approached the school and beg the chauffeur to park some distance away from the school gate, lest someone should see me getting out of that posh car. I would be embarrassed and perplexed, preparing words that would justify that ugly deed of mine to whoever might happen to see me. Without knowing it, I associated owning cars with some sort of authority. The authority of money or the authority of a regime. So one can imagine the impact of a Mercedes car on me. We used to hire a taxi to go to his village in Tartus, to Hotel Umayya or Sham Hotel, or to Al Bustan restaurant where he would meet his friends. He always sat next to me in the back seat. In Syria, that was considered an insult to the driver, since according to tradition, men were supposed to take the front seat, right next to the driver. But tradition meant nothing to him. He who favored reticence and conciseness would keep a conversation running with me for the whole trip, no matter how long it took. He realized that he would die soon and wished to take advantage of every moment we spent together. We would imagine the lives of the people whose houses we drove past through the open windows and the faint light flooding out of them. A certain life is throbbing behind those windows, my father would say to me. The taxi driver also lives a certain kind of life. The passers-by in the street ahead and the workers at the cafe too lead certain lives. We played games with those lives and made our imagination run wild, laughing with those people who wished to be happy and grieving with those who we wished to be sad, poor, or helpless. Life behind windows and walls held a great charm for him. It was as though that was the life he had yet to live. He knew it existed, and that put him at ease. He called me a few weeks before he passed away. I was in the next room. The shutters were open, allowing light to fill the room and stretch to my father's bed. He asked me to sit next to him on the bed and look out the window at a beautiful woman with long hair who was holding a baby. I looked and searched, but did not find that woman. He saw her in the ridged panes of the neighbors' windows. He was imagining people and existences in the ridged surfaces of windows which his room overlooked. That day I felt afraid and sad. The illness had become rooted in him, and he took to staring into the hollow and finding there what he loved and desired. He had wanted me to be a clothes designer or an architect, but he also wanted me to be what I liked to be, provided that I mastered my work. And then he was gone. I never told him that I liked to write, and I never dared to disclose what I liked until several years had passed. For we live in a society which nurtures a passion for the system of heredity and seeing the continuity of parents through their children, then grandchildren. Despite my fondness of writing, I used to frequently loathe it, particularly when I would be addressed simplistically and thoughtlessly. Aren't you going to follow in your father's footsteps? That unproductive and almost naive question would shatter my dreams and prevent me from pursuing my desire to write. Not because my father was a writer, but because I actually love to write. I take pleasure in writing and find that I exist through writing. That took years to settle. During those years, I moved from one hated job to another, until I decided that I would write, no matter how poor the quality of writing and how disappointing to many. At least my father will be glad that I am what I want to be. Thank you.
To sit here now. So first of all, again, thank you, Dima, for this very beautiful and touching text, and thank you, Ola, for really this very beautiful and touching translation. So we start right away with our first panel, in which we have 3 speakers. I'll briefly introduce them, and then we have the 3 talks, and we'll have the discussions and questions after the 3 talks. So we start with Friederike Pannewick. She is a professor of Arabic literature at the Center for Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Marburg. She's also the co-director of Traveling Traditions, Comparative Perspectives on Near Eastern Literature at the Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin. Her publications include Martyrdom and Literature, Visions of Death and Meaningful Suffering in Europe and the Middle East from Antiquity to Modernity, and her book that was published in German, Das Wagnistradition, Arabische Wege der Theatralität, in addition to numerous other studies on Arabic literature and theater. I would like to point out that she translated Wannous' play The Rape into German in the early 1990s, where it was produced in a number of different theaters. She is also the recipient of the 2012 Leibniz Prize, Germany's most important research award, given for the first time for Arabic studies and for Arabic literature. Thank you very much, Friederike, for coming. Elias Houri is an acclaimed novelist, critic, and public intellectual. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Palestine Studies and a visiting professor at the Lebanese American University. He has also taught at Columbia, New York University, and the American University of Beirut. He has published more than 10 novels, which have been translated into several languages. I'll just name some of them: The Journey of Little Gandhi, The Kingdom of Strangers, Gate of the Sun, Yalu, As Though She Were Sleeping, and The Broken Mirrors, Sinal Kol, which just came out in its English translation this year. Nada Saab is an assistant professor of Arabic studies at the Lebanese American University. She has written several studies on Arabic drama and translated plays by Saud Wannous, Issam Mahfouz, and Jawad al-Asadi from Arabic into English. He's currently working on a book on Levantine drama, co-authored with Robert Myers, to be published by Brill. Thank you very much, all three of you, for coming, and we start with Friederike's talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it fine, or should I? No? Okay, so I can. Okay, thank you very much, Sonia. I would start to thank you, Sonia, and Robert for the invitation to this international conference. It's my great pleasure and honor to be with you here and to speak to you today. You know, as a graduate student, I came for the first time to Syria as a visiting student to Al-Mahad Al-Ali Lil-Funun Al-Masrahiyya in Damascus. Saud was one of my teachers there, and to be sincere, he was my favorite teacher, and I had the enormous chance to be invited to come to his office after class and to discuss with him or to hear more about Arab theater and culture and all the richness of Arab culture and all its problems. And it was for me a kind of opening for my eyes, my ears, and my feelings. And now, 20 years later, I'm here talking on one of his plays. It's really a wonderful event for me. As we all know, Saud Wannous was or belonged to a generation of Arab intellectuals and artists whose political and artistic self-understanding was strongly molded by the Palestine conflict. At the end of his life, which we all know was cut short by the illness, he gave a rather bitter appraisal of the situation, and this is from the interview with Omar Amir Alai. He said, "How is our generation to ever be led to rest and find peace of mind? It will carry around in its thoughts a dull horror. It will resemble a wound. It will be the horror at the age they have lived through and the bitter, lifelong disillusionment. For Israel will still be there, even when our generation dies." International in his orientation, Saud was an intellectual who saw himself as part of a worldwide avant-garde movement. The early phase of his writing, from the beginning of the 60s to the 70s, was formatively influenced by Erwin Piscator's political theater, but above all by Bertolt Brecht's didactic theater. His initial works reveal an intensive social engagement, which he characterized in his theater manifesto, Bayanat li Masrah Arabi Jadid, from 1970, as a tazyiz al-masrah, a politicization of theater. In a phase marked by significant social developments triggered by the national defeat at the hands of Israel in the June War, Saud bravely and provocatively formulated the lineaments of a politicizing aesthetic, which was to make Arab theater into a vehicle of hope, instigating political reforms and motoring processes of democratization. He said, "We perform theater to develop and change consciousness. We want to deepen the grasp of our collective consciousness for our shared historical consciousness." Over the course of the next 10 years, Saud wrote several plays based on such political commitment, and these were produced throughout the Arab world on different stages. Then came President Sadat's speech to the Israeli parliament in 1977. And we all know this meant a world came crashing down for not only Saud but a whole generation of committed intellectuals in the Arab world. Saud did not write a single play for the next 12 years. He first broke his silence in 1989 with a play that was as celebrated as it was controversial, a play that attempted to relate to the Palestinian conflict from an Israeli viewpoint. Al-Ightisab, the rape. Analyzing human cruelty and its use of torture and violence, Al-Ightisab is a drama that itself violated a taboo of Arab society, namely to consider the other side of the conflict and to think about Israelis as people and not as faceless enemy, al-adu. This is why I have chosen this drama to demonstrate how Saud's way of understanding commitment changed and turned from a Brechtian politicization of theater to a new approach that sought to generate insight into social, individual, and psychological phenomena, a kind of individual humanism that counts for both sides of a conflict. In an interview in 1997, Saud explained this new approach, and I quote him, "My play tells about a Jewish man. He denounces the abuse and torture of Palestinians by the Shin Bet. I was subsequently accused of being an Israeli sympathizer. I was seen as paving the way for reconciliation. But my goal was to put an end to our feelings of shame. I wanted to destroy the notion that Israel is a taboo, a united homogeneous bloc, an enemy that has to be annihilated before it annihilates us. I've called this notion the retreat into the eternal animosity." The play is a harrowing analysis of violence in a state where the rule of law is flouted. It portrays an Israeli security officer who can no longer cope psychologically with torturing Palestinians during interrogations. He becomes impotent and visits a doctor. During the consultation, incidents from the interrogations are shown in flashbacks. A Palestinian is beaten and castrated, his wife then raped before his eyes, then he is murdered. Parallel to these scenes, in which the Secret Service member is also presented at home, the author unfolds the history of the suffering of the victim's family. The dramatic high point of the play is the attempt by the Israeli to break out of the spiral of violence with the help of the doctor. But instead of letting him go, his colleagues murder him, amongst them his stepfather, chief of the Secret Service. His wife is raped by one of the colleagues and flees to the US. The Palestinian wife of the victim, abused by the same Israeli, assumes the place of her husband in the resistance. In the last act, the doctor and the figure of the author take the stage and state their positions against the repression and violence being practiced on both sides. A number of Arab and particular Palestinian critiques condemned this play in the 1990s as being biased towards Israel. It is one of the very few plays from the Arab world to be performed in German translation in various productions in Germany and Austria. Revealingly, many German critics accused the author of presenting a biased pro-Palestinian view of things. We thus have a situation where different publics perceive and criticize diametrically opposed tendencies in the play. The fierce reactions, the play was banned in Syria before its premiere then, allow us to deduce that the author had gotten to the heart of the matter. It was a direct and political response of an artist in a state strictly censoring such open display of opinion. The staging of the play in Syria in December 1990 was only permitted in the form of a so-called public rehearsal held in a small room. A proper premiere in a theater then was prohibited. Then, as we heard in the following years, from 1991 to 1997, Saud wrote, as he put it, against death. The perspective evident in his writing shifted after the parallel tragic outbreak of the Gulf War and his illness. And along with it, his literary techniques and the characterization of figures changed. From the parable-like style of his politically accentuated didactic theater, where the figures were examples, in the final life of his creative writing, he addressed specific individual themes, exploring interpersonal problems, furnishing psychological studies, and achieving multidimensional characterization. And in an interview with Mari Ilyas in the mid-90s, Saud explained this turnaround in his work as stemming from the realization that, by the turn into the 1990s at the latest, political involvement in the Arab world was hopeless. The opposition groups in society were marginalized, the established political forces rotten to the core and hopelessly factionalized. Belief in being able to change the world through struggle, heroic acts, and martyrdom was suddenly revealed to be an illusion. And in these years, Saud bid farewell to the idea that had hitherto guided him, that the problems of the Arab world could be traced back to simple power relations in society. And this new style of drama led Saud to a kind of aesthetic liberation and self-discovery. He said in an interview, again with Mari Ilyas, "For the first time, I feel that writing is enjoyable. I was of the view that personal worries or individual problems were bourgeois, were superficial, unimportant affairs which one can put to one side. My whole interest was focused on grappling with and understanding history, and I thought wrongly that I had to avoid the traps of petit bourgeois literature and go beyond all that was individual and personal. For this reason, I never felt as if entirely at one with myself in my work as a playwright." My argument in this paper is that Al-Ikhtisab represents a turning point in Saud's work. In effect, it marks the passage from the politicization of theater to an individual humanism, a humanism that is to be understood as a new kind of deep political and humanist commitment. And I would now like very briefly look at this new dramatic style, taking the thematic aspect of violence and plotting how it impacts on one of the female protagonists, Talal. Talal is the wife of a resistance fighter who refuses to divulge any information despite torture. While in prison, she is raped by members of the Israeli Secret Service. Her husband is forced to look on at the violation, a method to induce confession. By the way, it's interesting to know that Saud wrote this play twice. The version we have in Amal Kamile from 1996 is the second one, and it differs in quite a few aspects from the first version published with Dar al-Adab in 1990. I'm familiar with the changes made because I translated the first version and published it in German in 1993. 2 years later, there was interest to bring the drama to stage in Germany. And when we asked Saadallah about the copyright, he told me that he had in fact rewritten the play in the wake of severe criticism in the Arab press, and that I would have to retranslate it, what I did. The second version was published in German in 1996 and put on stage there. But allow me to return to Talal and the impact of violence. Talal experiences how her husband is unable to protect her. Indeed, even his death in prison, his willingness to sacrifice himself and his wife for the cause of the resistance against the Israelis proves futile. Victory is far, far away. In the first version of the drama, from 1990, Talal returns from the Israeli prison deeply traumatized. Her personality is broken and fragmented. A burning but vague hatred feeds all her feelings. But in the second version, from 1996, Talal reacts differently to the experience of torture and sexual violence. The young woman decides to follow the path of self-sacrifice. Her actions follow a pattern taken by many historical and contemporary examples of female reactions towards suffered violations. She is ready to die in order to purify her body through death from this violation and humiliation. Her purification will be realized through killing both herself and Israeli soldiers. Talal begins to smuggle bundles of dynamite tied around her body through Israeli checkpoints. Should she be caught, she would blow up the soldiers and herself. Asked with astonishment whether she, as a woman, is not afraid of such an act, she answers, "I had several strong feelings, but fear was not among them. When I tied the bundle around my body and my belly became round and heavy, I felt a fruit rising in my womb. And when I walked down the street with my pregnant womb, my steps were as hard as steel. Nothing was in my way. I imagined how it would be to explode. My private parts would explode with me. My body would be purified and would fly in the empty space like an undefiled butterfly. Just in the moment of explosion, it flashed through me. I was ashamed because of my secret desire running through my veins. The bundles of dynamite were pushing on my navel. A burning sense of lust was overcoming me as I imagined how it would be to explode together with them and to be dispersed like a blazing inferno and devastating rubble. Death and sexual lust, happy ecstasy and purification are merging into one another. The explosion, my trembling full of lust, all became one. This quote demonstrates how the rape of this young woman frees her from any fear of death. She imagines her death as an act of revenge full of pleasure, directed against the culprits and as a means to purifying her own violated body. Here, violence against the female body leads to an act of demonstrative autoaggression by the victim that is imagined by an erotic moment. Talal is driven to seek out death as a way of revenging the suffered violence and purifying herself from this humiliation. Her feelings of sexual desire are connected to imagining personal revenge in a violent political conflict. The drama thus revolves around corporality, liminality, and individuation, with the individuation dealt with as a process that also entails political emancipation. This disturbing and shocking passage in Saadallah's drama is interesting in the context of my argument here because it shows the dramatist's new approach, namely to generate insight to individual and psychological phenomena and thus create a new style which I would like to call individual humanism. In his earlier dramas, like Mughamarat Ra's al-Mamluk Jabir or Al-Fil Ya Malik al-Zaman, violence is already an important issue. But these dramas are parables in the style of Brecht's didactic theater. They explore the problems and issues which emerge when civil courage and political criticism are forced to confront a totalitarian and disenfranchising system based on violence and repression. In this earlier stage of his writing in the 60s, Saud dealt with violence as a structural problem. And his argument was based on the assumption that the problems of the Arab world could be traced back to simple power relations to society or in society. In Al-Ikhtisab, however, the focus is put on the individual. What are the consequences of violence on human beings? What does it mean for an individual to either suffer violence and so be on the victim side of violence, or instead to commit violence and so be on the perpetrator side? And who is the perpetrator and who a victim? Can a distinction be drawn clearly at all? To reflect on these critical and crucial questions and their philosophical dimensions, I would like to draw on the famous and yet unresolved conflict between Camus and Sartre over terrorism, violence, and colonialism. The two men disagreed over how to overcome the structural violence of imperialism and colonialism, and whether terrorism can ever be justified. In his preface to Fanon's Le Damné de la Terre, Sartre argues in favor of violence as a liberating force in the struggle for nationhood. And I quote Sartre's, "A fighter's weapon is his humanity. For in the first phase of the revolt, killing is necessary. Killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed, leaving one man dead and the other man free. For the first time, the survivor feels a national soil under his feet. In that moment, the nation does not forsake him. It is there wherever he goes and wherever he is, always by his side. It merges with his freedom." Camus, on the other side, in essays and dramas like Les Justes et l'Homme Révolté, was keenly aware that revolutionary violence always entailed more, much more, than the rejection and overcoming of oppression. Camus deemed that means of war, including terrorism and torture, are both historically and philosophically impotent. Such brutal methods could only produce more killing. Camus could not appreciate the cleansing role of violence preached by Sartre. Violence and terrorism would not humanize the Arab Muslim population. Indeed, terrorism would only dehumanize the Arabs. At a meeting organized by l'Amitié Française, Camus opposed the Communist Party's approach and spoke out against the violent behavior condoned in 1945, saying, quote Camus, "Some of the Nazi hatred has remained with us. Our poisoned heart must be cured, and the most difficult battle to be won must be fought within ourselves, with an exceptional effort that will transform our appetite for hatred into desire for justice." Camus dreamed of a solution to the Algerian conflict with a minimum of violence, while refusing, one has to admit, to acknowledge the colonial privilege of his Pieds Noirs community. And according to Ronald Aronson, he repressed the reality of the FLN. He refused to connect violence with the facts of Arab life in French-ruled Algeria. In his principled, almost deontological opposition to overt violence, he never talked about daily life, ignoring the violence-imposed privilege of the French. But returning to Al-Ikhtisab, in this drama's representation of violence, I would argue that what we have here is a position somewhat in between Sartre's and Camus' respective conception of violence in a political struggle. Saud's play goes a step further by reflecting on the impact and consequences of violence for individual human beings. He takes a closer look at both sides. The side of the victim suffering violence and the side of the perpetrator inflicting violence on others. What is highly telling and unique in this drama is the fact that there are perpetrators and victims on both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian. And in some instances, victims transmute into perpetrators. Talal is at first a victim, but after having suffered rape, she experiences a transformation into a perpetrator. Is this the kind of emancipating violence from below in the context of a liberation struggle which Sartre and Fanon had in mind? I would like to ask here. Fanon argues that violence, and I quote Fanon, violence rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence. Even if the armed struggle has been symbolic, and even if they have been demobilized by rapid decolonization, the people have time to realize that liberation was the achievement of each and every one, and no special merit should go to the leader. Quote. This emancipating function of violence from below is also intrinsic to Sartre's logic in his preface to The Wretched of the Earth. Violence, according to Sartre, is not only the essential tool of oppression, but also the only possible path to liberation. And so, non-violence only serves to perpetuate oppression. And how about Talal? Is violence in her case the only possible path to liberation and emancipation? If we stay within the frame of the play, and essentially in its second version, one could easily argue, yes. Talal imagines her violent death at an Israeli checkpoint as a purifying and liberating act. It is a clear case of violence from below. But this is not the end of the story. The drama ends with an epilogue, which in my mind is unique in Arabic theater so far. An Israeli psychoanalyst, Dr. Menachem, enters together with Saud Wannous, the theoretical figure of the author, and they now take the stage to discuss the political implications and human dimensions of the play. Dr. Menachem, within the drama's plot, was the psychotherapist who treated both the Israeli Secret Service member, Ishaq, who suffered from sexual impotence because of the daily routine, of torture and abuse during his work, and his wife Rahel, who suffered from anxious psychosis without knowing what kind of work her husband was involved in all the day long. Here we witness the other side of violence and its psychosomatic consequences on the side of the perpetrator. Any clearly distinct borderline between victim and perpetrator is blurred, as in the case of Talal, who imagined carrying out a suicide attack after having been raped from precisely this man. Liberating and the traumatizing sides of violence are both at display here. And this is possible because the drama focuses on the psychological aspects and consequences of a political struggle. This epilogue is, in my mind, a clear indication of Saud's turn to a new approach and his efforts to generate insights into individual and psychological phenomena. And this creates this new style, which I, as already mentioned, would like to call individual humanism. The individual and his or her specific suffering is a central focus of interest here. The epilogue shows an author, Saud, who questions simple black-white dichotomies by pointing to cases of human rights violations and political persecution in the Arab world, thus striving to provide the audience with a somewhat more balanced worldview after having shown so much violence in Israeli prisons. At the end of my talk, please allow me to quote from this epilogue and thus to give, so to say, the last word to Saud himself. He says in this epilogue, I have to admit that in the prisons on our side there is just as little compassion and just as much cruelty. But do you really believe that these regimes and their prisons represent us, or that our struggle with Israel even concerns them? No, sir. Our problem is multi-layered. Today, Zionism has found its organic continuation in the current Arab system. That's those who capitulate to Meir's Israel and those who are willing to capitulate. Those who suppress their people and contemptuously trample all over them. Those who rob the riches of these countries and squander it all. They all represent, in a certain way, a continuation of Zionism in an Arab system. The entanglement on our side is complicated. And so the way out of this entanglement demands a complex and difficult struggle. Yes, sir, the impartiality must be on both sides, even if the price that needs to be paid for it is oppressively heavy. This historical entanglement can only be resolved by paying an enormously high price. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Friederike. We'll have the discussion, as said earlier, afterwards. Our next speaker is Elias Houri, who is speaking about Wannous as playwright and as writer and public intellectual.
شكرا سونيا، صباح الخير. الحقيقة بعد ما سمعت كلمة ديما ونوس الجميلة حسيت أني وقعت حالي بالفخ، لأني قررت أحكي بالإنجليزي. كان لازم أقبل عرض سونيا أني أحكي بالعربي. هلا it's too late. تورطنا وكتبنا النص بالإنجليزي. بس رجاء يعني تخيلوا الأصل العربي اللي خلف الإنجليزي، مشان بس يعني تمشوا معي بالنص اللي أنا كتبته. Of course, first of all, I want to thank you, Sonia, and the organizers and everybody who is here. Although I think that the way you are sitting makes us feel, we here on the panel, that it's an empty place, whereas it's not. But I don't know why you have chosen to sit very, very, very far from us. Maybe to give us the freedom to fight each other's. Because I think after Frederica's speech, a fight is building up, and I will mention a little bit about the fight in my presentation, and then I hope we can discuss thoroughly this Camus Sartre problematic, putting Saud Wannous in this problematic, which I thought is totally discussed fully, because Saud was a communist. And this is the classical communist position in Palestine. I mean, this is not what Saud Allah's approach was in Al-Iqtisab, was mainly the project of André Gromyko in the United Nations when he accepted the partition plan, and then all the communist parties in the Arab world changed their positions and accepted the partition plan, and the Palestinian Jabhat Taharrur al-Watani began speaking of a colonialist war waged by the Arab armies against the state of Israel. So we are in a very problematic political situation, and I think Al-Iqtisab, of course, it's a very important play on the other levels you spoke about, but politically speaking, it must be put in its political frame, which is part of the debate inside the Arab left and inside the Palestinian movement itself. Anyway, the title I changed the title of my speech, Sonia, if you don't mind. It's entitled "The Writer and His Shadow." The image that the film of Omar Emir Alai, "There Are Many Things Still to Say," wanted us to keep in our memory is the double picture of the intellectual. The face of Saud Wannous is shown in two different ways. As a patient who is facing death on one hand, and as part of the serum that is injected in his blood on the other. Wannous will be divided between the patient and his image, emerging on the drip chamber of the IV injection serum. The writer is facing his double, and it's left to us to decide who of the two is the writer and who is the double, who is the real and who is the shadow. The question of the relationship between the poet and his shadow was never an issue in the classical Arabic poetry. The dual al-musanna united both and made from poetry a tool of an interior dialogue between the two faces of the poet. A patient lying on the hospital's bed was speaking about the defeat, which can be perceived as a cancer killing the nation and the man, while the image of the other is shown as part of a healing process that will never come. Reading the film of Amir Alai through this double image of the intellectual will be an adequate introduction to understand a whole phase of the leftist Arabic modern culture that can be labeled as literature of protest. Based on the concept of engagement, this literature will go beyond the rigid Marxist interpretation of the concept in order to build a field of literary protest influenced by different sources. The Brechtian epic theater, reinventing the classical forms, Al-Hakawati, Samir, 1001 Nights, and so on, existentialism, the absurd theater, and the nouveau roman. The works of San'Allah Ibrahim, Ghalib Halassa, Yusuf Idris, Abdullah Wannous, and many others can be read in this perspective. One can put what I'm calling protest literature in the frame of the post-1967 defeat. The major works of this literature were published around that year, which was a turning point in the collapse of the nationalist leftist discourse. But we must add to this hypothesis the fact of the disenchantment with the image of the hero, which dominated the Arabic modern poetry with its Tammuzian approach. This image will be shaken profoundly by the tyrannical nature of the military regimes that will lead most of the Egyptian writers of the 60s to the prisons of Nasir. The defeat and the disenchantment with the hero will create the conditions of the birth of this literature, a literature which leaves behind the optimism of the socialist realism and its rigid forms, and paves the way for the emergence of new stylistic approaches, creating a critical literature of protest that will not cut with the dominant leftist ideology of the so-called non-capitalist way of the military regimes, but will be its critical double. The protest will be the gate to unconventional forms and to a critical literature that will find a kind of political and ideological representation in the emerging Palestinian resistance movement. This is at least the case of Saudallah Wannous, who will join the voices of Kanafani and Darwish in their attempt to deal with the Palestinian struggle, paving the way to get over the taboos through putting the struggle for Palestine in its context as a humanistic struggle that will try to understand the other and open a perspective of a common Arab-Jewish struggle against the Zionist colonial project. Dr. Minuhin and Rahil of the Rape will join Miriam of Return to Haifa and Rita of the Love Poems of Darwish in this long and difficult struggle. In 1992, the theater of Beirut, where I occupied the function of its artistic director, presented the Rape in the version of Jawad al-Asadi. There I witnessed a very special experience. The The actors and actresses who were playing Israeli characters used to prepare themselves in the backstage through singing collectively Arab national songs of the era of Nasser. Playing Israeli characters through the method acting of Stanislavski was not an easy adventure, and their way was to plunge in a nationalist discourse in order to remind themselves who they are before their total identification with their Israeli roles. For me, this was a strange experience, but I used to join them, finding in their way a kind of an Aristotelian catharsis. This story reveals the interior struggle needed to cross the border and to go beyond the dominant discourse that was unfortunately adapted by the director of the play when he jumped over the dialogue between Dr. Minuhin and the author, ending the performance with one of its problematic phrases, either we or them. I began with the rape not only because of its special place in the new formulation of the Palestinian struggle that led Edward Said to define the Palestinians as the victims of the victims, but also because in the dialogue between the Israeli psychiatrist and the Syrian author, Wannous talks about the difficulties of being honest as an Arab intellectual, living under oppressive regimes that made from prisons a way of life, and from naked force its only way to govern a people that was treated as the slaves of the governing dynasties. As a Syrian writer, Wannous was aware of his role as an intellectual facing the terror of the regime, whose legitimacy was based on what was left from the national discourse in the hand of the oppressive state apparatus. He began his career as a playwright with his play حفلة سمر من أجل الخامس من حزيران about the disastrous defeat in 1967. First of all, he was one of the rare voices to name the defeat with its name, instead of using the misleading term Naksa, coined by the Egyptian journalist Muhammad Hassanein Haikal and used by Nasser in his discourse of resignation on June the 8th, 1967. Second, with this play, the political theater of Brecht will take its legitimacy in the cultural field. And third, is the project of the writer to blur the difference between the stage and the audience in an attempt to create a democratic platform in a society dominated by the total absence of freedom of expression. In his efforts to overcome the dampness imposed on the Syrian society, theater will lead Wannous to discover different approaches, from adapting stories from the Nights to rewriting Homme pour Homme of Brecht in The King is the King, to rebuilding the geography of passion and social political oppression in Rituals of Science and Transformation. He never forgot his role as a public intellectual whose freedom was threatened by the fragile compromise that led the Syrian left either to be absorbed by the regime or to disappear in its prisons. Between these double-edged threats, the playwright had to find his way to navigate with his words and to create a margin that can represent the ideals of the writer in a kind of an absurd struggle. One of the major aspects of this struggle was the language. The man of theater had to solve the huge problem of duality between colloquial and classical. Yusuf Idris solved it through adapting the colloquial Egyptian. Lebanese modern theater used a simple classical language before it shifted towards the colloquial, while Wannous had to invent his own theatrical language. I was always fascinated by his ability to reach a language. When you hear on stage or read it in a book, you forget whether it is classical or colloquial. A language that creates a kind of Brechtian distance without being an obstacle for the flow of the dialogue. In one of my rare visits to Damascus, and while we were discussing the use of the colloquial Lebanese in my novels, I asked him how can he conceive dialogue in classical Arabic. Do you dream in classical Arabic, I asked. Wannous burst out laughing before revealing to me that his first attempts are done in colloquial. Then the process of writing and rewriting will lead him to his simple classical Arabic. Then you are not only a writer, but a translator, said. It took me a long time to realize that all writers are translators, and a major part of their work is to discover ways of translating what looks as mute and ununderstandable into an adequate language, لغة ملائمة. Wannous participated in writing the film of Amir Alai, Everyday Life in a Syrian Village. In this film, we discover a critical, tender language, a language of the beginnings that will be replaced in the films of Amir Alai with a bitter, critical language. On the other hand, Wannous will create in his play the drunken days, Al-Ayyam al-Makhmoura, based upon the true story of the grandmother of Omar Amir Alai, the tenderness of a love story as part of his research for an adequate language that can incarnate love and passion. I'm not trying here to take sides with or to create a wall between these two languages. All what I'm trying to say that they can be complementary and that the artist, writer, and intellectual was forced to use different ways in order to navigate in the face of the absurdity and banality of oppression. Wannous died in a symbolic day, May 15, 1997. I don't understand the wisdom of destiny, but it seems to me that there is a kind of wisdom here. The writer of the rape died in the Nakba day, as if his journey had to end on the day where the disaster of Palestine and the Arabs began. I remember the scene in his village, Hussein al-Bahar. I was sitting surrounded by men coming from all over the place. At a moment, the Syrian filmmaker Osama Muhammad took me outside and showed me a poster. Look, he said, we arrived to print the poster of Saudallah in spite of the mukhabarat. I didn't understand the enthusiasm of Osama printing the picture of a dead man, of Osama. Printing the picture of a dead man seemed obvious for someone like me coming from Beirut. Osama explained to me that this was totally impossible under the regime. And in order to print a poster of anyone, except, of course, the president, and in order to print of the president, you must take a permission which seems impossible for someone like Saudallah Wannous. The poster was white with a beautiful picture of the writer, and under it was his name and the date of his death. This is incredible. Saudallah won in the end, said Osama. Yes, I said, without realizing what made me share the joy of my friend. Now, I realize that the memory of the poster will take me to the film of Amir Alai. And here, I see the picture of the writer inside the drip chamber of the injection serum. Who is the writer and who is the double? I think that none of the pictures can play the role of the double or the shadow. Double is incarnated in the words written by Wannous, And I may dare now to say that the writer is the shadow of his words, and that reality is incarnated in these imaginary characters that will live long after.
Thank you very, very much, Ilyas. I think people are getting ready for the discussion, but we have one more talk, Nada Saab, and she's speaking about the author as character and voice in Wannous' plays. So it sounds like there's going to be some interesting overlap to the previous talk. Thank you, Nada.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. Is it okay? Yes, I think it is. Okay, the topic of my talk actually sprang out from the last scene in The Rape, which was just produced recently. Saadallah Wannous comes up as a character at the end of the play, which is, as Frederica said, it's quite unique in Arabic drama, and it prompted me to actually find where Saadallah is present in his plays, his voice or his character. How come he has written himself as a character in such a manner? Theater is a mirror, Wannous suggests, but he asks that we forgo with a metaphorical mirror and place instead a real mirror on stage that occupies its entire space. He imagines the audience to be predominantly bourgeois and petit bourgeois, an audience which provokes him to create theater with the highest potential for mischief. The mirror that is wide, clean, and self-confident lays like a beast of prey, catching the spectators confused. They are comforted at first by seeing their own reflection in the mirror, but as the game continues, each of the spectators becomes more and more agitated, as he or she becomes the subject of the stares of others. This kind of theater is void of deception and lies, and is catharsized, as Wannous has said, in the manner that it has discarded all of its tools except for a mirror and a light. A space that is all lit effectually eliminates the separation between stage and auditorium. The game of audience manipulation will not end until the spectators leave, or rather escape, resentful and embittered and consumed by the horrifying thought that the mirror is stalking them. Wannous introduced the third volume of his complete works, which is dedicated to his theoretical writings, with this scene. In figurative dramatization, it summarizes his view of the menacing role and the relationship of the menacing role of theater and the relationship he sees forged between performance and audience. In the scene he imagined above, the spectators looked at their reflections not in the mirror, but in Saadallah's eyes. It was his gaze that was directed back at them. Wannous employed several strategies to have his presence either direct or implied vividly noticed. Storytellers, medieval historical chroniclers, or choruses are some examples of characters that he lent his voice to. More telling is Wannous writing himself as one of the characters of his play, The Rape. In the last scene, one of the play's main characters summons his creator, Saadallah Wannous, to stage. Wannous enters and both engage in a dialogue in which Wannous' craftsmanship is questioned and his convictions are scrutinized. Such marked presence of Wannous as character or voice is, of course, the focus of this presentation. The Rape, published in 1990 and written after a lull of 12 or 13 years, dramatizes the Arab-Israeli struggle, or as he called it, our core cause, قضيتنا المحورية. It is adapted from Antonio Buero Vallejo's The Double Case History of Dr. Valmy that indicts police torture through the point of view of a police security officer whose guilt over the torture he exerted on his prisoners turns inward to torment him. The rape also explores the brutality of Israeli security officers during the first Palestinian Intifada that stretched between 1978 and 83. Regarding the similarity between both stories, Wannous warns that, and I open quote, "the true dramatic inspiration has never existed in a story in itself, but rather in novel approaches that allow the spectator to ponder his or her historical and existential condition." End of quote. His adaptation of Vallejo's play departs from the latter in two ways. First, it has two storylines, one Israeli and another Palestinian, that are intertwined and contribute to each other's growth. Second, it has Wannous himself written in it, and which discusses his view with another of the play's characters at the end of the play. The play shows a Palestinian resistance fighter taken prisoner by Israeli security police. As you just said, the wife is raped, and during the rape party, as it is called, one of the main protagonists, Ishaq, who is the torturer, exceeds his mate, the rapist Gideon, in brutality and mutilates the woman with his razor blade. Obviously, an act of overcompensation for his inability to participate in the rent. And I think this is a comment you had mentioned in your book, Dr. Wannous intrinsically connects the Palestinian and the Israeli stories through the families of the tortured and the torturer. This intricate connection is further achieved when both the Palestinian woman and the wife of Ishaq are raped by the same man. Both communities are susceptible to the same form of violence propagated by the system. Ishaq's infliction of torture causes him to become impotent. A psychiatrist who is skeptic of Zionist ideology prognoses his condition as self-inflicted punishment. In order for you to be healed, he explains, you must either consciously admit that you committed a horrible crime that cannot be justified, or you must be absolutely convinced that these acts are just worthy of respect. In his heart of hearts, no one can possibly be convinced of the latter. He adds, part of our Zionist upbringing is constantly teaching us to hate, but those who raise us don't consider that there's a limit beyond which, psychologically, human beings cannot go. Absolute hatred is the threshold to a realm in which everything can be justified and anything that threatens one's stability can simply be shut out. But who can give himself over to absolute hatred and not fall to pieces? Ishaq's discovery of the illusions of his Zionist upbringing make him realize Zionism as a pompous historical impotence, he says, shining behind the mask of superiority and cruelty. He becomes like his father, who was skeptical of the veracity of the Israeli state, and like his father, is killed as a result of it. In the Israeli story, three characters share the skeptic view of Israel, two of whom, Ishaq and his father, are doomed by death. The third, Dr. Menuhin, the psychiatrist, takes pride in his skepticism because he says it protects him from the spiritual misery in which the miraculous state of Israel is sinking. His loyalty to justice, not to law, naturally agrees with the standpoint of Wannous. It is important to note that while the play sheds light on the brutality that faces Palestinians, it focuses on Zionism as an entity that devours itself. For an Arab audience, this sort of transference is at risk of giving a false sense of redemption, a satisfaction for seeing Zionist Israel on its path towards self-destruction. Wannous' apparition diverts the audience from falling into such cathartic and submissive lull. Not to mention that it gives some emotional relief after sustained and escalating crude violence. It redirects the attention to the character of Dr. Menuhin, who is, after all, the counterpart of Wannous, also as Dr. Sitter has contended. The recent production of the play by Sahar Assaf and Robert Meyer seems to underscore my observation. The performance is uninterrupted and scenes flow from one another seamlessly, highlighting the interconnectedness of characters and stories. The office of Dr. Menuhin is on a mezzanine level that allows him to observe events as they are enacted downstage. In the final scenes of the play, he sees Ishaq killed. The mother enters and coldly receives the news of her son's death, but soon collapses to the floor, embracing the body of her son. Lights keep shining on the mother-son scene as the next scene proceeds, where Rahil, Ishaq's wife, ascends to Dr. Menuhin's office. She bids him goodbye before she travels to America as if expunged out of Israel. He says, spread this story widely as you can. We won't collaborate with them, and we won't allow them to seize the future. Lights fade on the doctor's office, but keep shining on mother and son for several moments until they fade completely, enveloping the stage and auditorium with darkness. The audience is silent, as if stunned by the ending and by the grueling unfolding of events throughout the play. Several moments pass before the spectators realize that the play has ended. But contrary to their assumption, the play hasn't ended. Soon, lights shine again on both the auditorium and the stage, giving the sensation of a unified space. The psychiatrist comes out of character, sums his creator, and subjects him to the anti-questioning, as I said. Why is he created? Is it possible for people like him to exist? Or is it possible for him to be as ethical as he was portrayed? He even accuses Wannous of being naive. Wannous admits that such a character was initially a wishful thought that was driven by his conviction that unless people like this exist, history would be nothing but a bleak wasteland. In moments as ragged as these, he says, it's vital for a character to appear who push lies aside and behold the horizon of another sort of future. Wannous revives the biblical example of Jeremiah, who proclaimed Judah's destruction as a result of its sins, in contrast to the biblical literature that is proclaimed by Zionist characters, to kill every man, woman, child, camel, etc. The character questions the significance of his creation when all he does is to reject and protest. Such self-reflection is a projection of Wannous' own self-reflection. Like Menuhin, he needed to reach beyond the psychological and historical barriers in order to see the other. A review of the recent production of The Rape commented on the meeting of Wannous and Menuhin, saying enacting a conversation between nominal enemies would be considered an act of treason were it real, and that the two men demonstrate the possibility of engaging in a constructive dialogue with the other. Rabbi Amrouwi equally finds this meeting to be stepping on treacherous land, the repercussions of which are only averted by the fact that it is an imagined, not a real meeting. Yet, even Wannous sees that artistic possibility is subject to liability and condemnation. An ethical stand requires one to denounce Zionism as well as Arab states who have their own versions of oppressive regimes. The comparison drawn between the Zionist state and the Arab states makes the events that unfold in the play even more grueling for its spectators. They are forced to identify the victims not as Palestinians or other fellow Arabs, but as themselves. While it is unique to say Wannous himself written in a play to deliver it to its final revelation, it is not unique to find characters created to deliver his own voice. A comparison can be drawn with an earlier play, The Elephant, O Lord of Ages, which opens on a similarly grueling image. A young boy is trampled by the elephant of the king. The man who tells what he saw has no name, like all other characters who have numbers except for one, Zachariah. This man, numbered one, takes refuge in God and recounts the horrors he witnessed. With my own eyes, I saw him turn to paste from flesh and blood. I saw with my own eyes how his stomach was battered and his innards became all mingled with the dust of the street. His body completely lost its shape, a squashed mass of flesh. Have you ever seen eggs when they fall to the ground? By Allah, his body was just like that, a mass of blood and guts scattered all across the street. The characters emotionally identify with the boy's parents and invoke God to give them power and strength to endure the calamity. It It is fate, one woman says, and they engage in a tangent issue that draws them away from the real reasons and consequences of such an event. Would it be pure to bury the boy without the ritual washing? The crowd's paralyzing fear is not broken until Zakaria appears and incites them to realize the cause of their calamities and face it to enforce a change. He urges them to complain to the king about the elephant whose destruction is added to famine, meager earnings, high taxes, and so on. Zakaria warns them they should recite their complaint together, in one voice, to symbolize collective political action. The first act ends with the characters trying to synchronize their speech but are unsuccessful at that task. When they face their king, they are mesmerized by the opulence of his palace and are harassed by the guards that renders them speechless. The king grows impatient by their silence and directs his threats at them. The stage direction says, Zakaria looks hard at the people, disdainfully and desperately. For a few moments he hesitates and then his face transforms. He goes up to the king and expresses his and everyone's love of the elephant. Being all alone is unnatural, O Lord of ages. Therefore, we thought that we, your subjects, should come and petition you for a marriage for the elephant in order to relieve his loneliness, so he can bestow upon us scores of elephants, hundreds and thousands. The king is charmed by the affection of his people and rewards them with several decrees: to dispatch a mission to India to search for a she-elephant, to reward Zakaria by appointing him constant companion of the elephant, and to have a wedding with 5 days and nights of celebration. All are dumbfounded and are given permission to leave. The stage directions further say that they withdrew submissively, lights dim for a moment, and then all actors get out of their roles. They stand in a row in front of the audience and they say, "This is a tale and we are all actors. We have performed it for you so we can learn its moral with you. Do you now realize why there are elephants around? But our tale is simply a beginning. When there are elephants aplenty, another tale begins, a tale full of blood and violence, and another night we will all tell that tale." The reciprocal betrayal of the townsmen and Zakaria to their common cause created a bloodline that sustained the tormenting political system and gave it power to regenerate. The collective presence of the actors who have shaken off their roles serves practically as the mouthpiece of Wannous. It tells the audience they are not spectators but active agents in the stories played to them. Their active or passive engagement in their surroundings will decide the stories they are to see, which are in effect his prophecies for the future. Warding criticism for the negative light in which his society is portrayed, Wannous readdressed the question to be involved in audience reception. He thought the correct question a critic should ask is not whether the townspeople of the play represent our own people, but rather what sort of creation would the audience have when they perceive the people's panic. He says, the audience reactions will range between anger and sorrow. Both these reactions are positive, so where's the negativity? The relation between stage and audience, forged through reciprocal stories, is no better portrayed than in Mamluk Jaber's head. Wannous again reserves a carrier for his voice who explains why certain characters tie him to the audience and not others. The play has two storylines depicting two Arab societies at two different historical moments. The play structure of a play within a play allows participants of one story to be perceiving the other. The setting is a cafe with a traditional storyteller, a Hakawati, telling the heroic story of Mamluk Jaber. It takes them to Baghdad that fell prey to the power struggle between the caliph and the wazir. As the latter conspired to seek outside assistance, the caliph had the city closed off in fear that communication be exchanged between the vizier and outside. Jaber, an astute Mamluk, devises a ruse to have the vizier's message to raid the city smuggled out. He suggested be tattooed on his shaven head, and then he'd be able to smuggle it outside as his hair grows back. The Hakawati who narrates Jaber's story to the cafe patrons looks neutral and detached throughout the play. His emotional distancing is contrasted with the audience's involvement with what is narrated, that is further strengthened as it is enacted among them. The shared space and the fluid continuous movement between both storylines exemplifies the connection between both. Hakawati's audience sees Jabir unconcerned with the turmoil in his city and identifies with his apathy. On the other hand, everyone is enthralled by Jabir's will to manipulate his surroundings to arise above his allotment in life. His friend Mamlouk Mansour repudiates his unwillingness to, quote-unquote, use his head to discover the reasons behind the unrest that surrounds them. Another man, identified as man number 4, among the cafe patrons shares Mansour's attitude, which creates another level of connectedness between the parallel stories. While Jabir's wit is captivating, his skewed use of his head ironically leads to his horrific death. As he serves his mission, his head is decapitated. The decree for his death was tattooed on his head. The executioner rolls the head towards the Hakawati, who picks it up unceremoniously. His cafe audience is dismayed, but with the same cold demeanor, he reads the message tattooed on Jabir's head and then describes the horrors that befell the city after it was raided. The play ends with the man, number 4, rising among those killed as the city was ransacked, and walks with the Hakawati to face the cafe's customers and the audience of Wannous's play alike. We speak to you from the gloomy night of Baghdad, they say. We speak to you from the night of disasters, death and corpses. You say we don't care. Whoever marries our mother, we call our uncle. No one can prevent you from saying that, but if you look around someday, you will find yourselves strangers in your own homes. If heads roll and death welcomes you at the threshold of gloomy morning, don't forget that you said once, we don't care. Whoever marries our mother, we call our uncle. The cafe customers are unable to understand the Hakawati's message. They insist on hearing the heroic story of Beirut the following night in order to lift their sorrows and distance themselves from the peril they live in. But the time for stories of heroism has not come yet. Wannous has given his authorial voice to the Hakawati and has also given him the same will and ability to use stories of the past to speak allegorically of the present. The hybridity of stories and the space they share can easily be extended to reach the audience of Wannous, making them the third level of performance. Wannous had even suggested that the play be performed in a cafe house to further eliminate the space between audience and performance. This was never done, even though a direction of Jawad al-Asadi tried to mimic this atmosphere in having some cafe tables set up in the auditorium before the stage to give the illusion of a common and continuous space. The space between performance and audience is fluid with no clear demarcations in these plays. Wannous dramatized similar spaces through which his voice could come through. In these precarious spaces, certain characters are able to trespass and weave together different periods or storylines. Whichever guise he took, it generally appeared objectively cold and calculating. His direct voice appears to have subsided as he moved away from Brechtian devices of estrangement in favor of creating characters with very distinct and complex psychologies, as you have mentioned. His voice is most distinctly heard in plays where characters represent types, traits, attitudes, or ideologies. They have numbers, for example, as we saw in Mamlouk Jabari. Within such a setup, it is understandable to see one type created to impersonate his view or outlook. Generally, such character that would be able to get out of role to impersonate him or to join multiple spaces, stories, or timelines. In all cases, however, history plays a crucial role in his creations. Regardless of whether his characters are types or individuals with distinct and complex psychologies, they are all representations of historical processes. They are all, like his spectators, responsible for the history they perceive and the history they make. With his marked presence in his plays, Wannous gave dialogue an added dimension, one in which he would participate within the many levels of dialogue necessary in theater and beyond. Levels that he saw extending from dialogue within the action itself to a more implicit dialogue between the stage and the spectators, among the audience themselves, and further beyond between performance and the public on the one hand and the city on the other. It is this kind of dialogue that gives a new sense of societal affiliation and extends the nature and role of theater from being a manifestation of civic society to being a prerequisite for the development of such society. In various examples of his plays, even where the gloomiest end is foreseen, there arise characters who are able to hold an alternate vision. Menuhin in The Rape, Mansour and the Fourth Man in Mamluk Jaber's Head, and the little girl who wouldn't stop asking why the elephant had trampled the boy. In all these examples, Wannous gave an image of his pessimist self that is best expressed in his famed statement, "We are doomed by hope, and what happens today cannot be the end of history." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nada. So thank you to all three again. First of all, Friederike, for linking the developments that you traced from politicizing theater to individual humanism to a larger discussion on violence, and here bringing to mind Camus, Sartre, and Fanon. Thank you, Elias, really for framing Wannous' play The Rape into the larger debate, into a political context, first of all, and into the larger debate within the Arab left, and for leaving us with this really powerful image of picture on the poster. And Nada, thank you really for putting emphasis on this last scene and on ways how Wannous managed to inscribe himself as character into his plays. I suggest that we open the discussion right away. I'm sure there are many questions. Elias already called for a battle, right? So let's see how things go.
What the light said.
We can.
And it's conspiracy.
I assume the lights go back on. Maybe we have to press a button somewhere, or do they come automatically? I don't know. This room is so sophisticated. No buttons. Let's assume the light comes back on at some stage. We can start talking in the dark. Please, I saw one hand go up. Tariq. But maybe you can very briefly just introduce yourself, with light or without.
My name is in this play. The product of the defeats that take place within, as you indicated, of the 67 war, but also within the ideological divisions within the communists and the literary communists from Yusuf al-Sabai right the way down the line from the journals that they were writing, that this was a reflection of that. But Friederike, I was really quite alarmed by the speed with which you were trampling over concepts within history and avoiding issues of the theft of land, of the fact of colonization, of racism, and the interpretation of that. If we transform the loss of Palestine to some pathological issue and look at it in that way, that seems to fit a very clear-cut modern agenda that your terrorists are pathological nonsense and ours are somehow representative of a process. To what extent is this reinterpretation fitting into the sort of modern concepts which are really getting rid of the core issues, what the problem behind and underneath was the theft of land by a whole colonial process? And finally, really, the question of the other reference that this isn't something unique or even unique in the Arab world. Our poets who wrote the drama from here right the way across into South Asia were constantly bringing themselves in as characters within their poetry, and then of course poetry being the vehicle of writing drama at that time. So in that sense it's a continuous right the way from this tip of West Asia right to the other end. And really my final point on this thing is again to you, Friederike, talking about the victims and the perpetrators, is this some sort of a new thing that we are all equals now in our... I mean, I found it, I'm dumbfounded with also the individual humanism. Humans exist because of our collectivity. Individualism exists because of its individuality. And that forms very well into a Western narrative, I should think.
Tara is suggesting that we make another.
Actually, if you want to reply to your questions, which are, I think, are very interesting, we have to repeat the whole thing. But to be just brief, of course, your remark about question about the left and the impact of the defeat of 1967 on the interior debate inside the leftist movement in the Arab world, and first of all inside Palestine and in the Arab world, is very interesting and it's very important. And actually, just not to be fair, because it's impossible to be fair in 2 minutes. To be fair, one can say that the defeat was read in the intellectual level from mainly two major different points of view. One of them was the criticism of the regimes, which would lead to a process of Marxization, let's say, of the Palestinian movement. The Arab National Movement will adopt Marxism-Leninism, and then the Popular Front, the Democratic Front, and so on and so forth. The second thing was the awareness of the communist parties that they are outside the enjeu. They wanted to enter the enjeu in a way or another, which reflected itself in the in the conference of the Lebanese Communist Party in 1968, which changed the whole discourse, the communist discourse, from accepting partition to refusing partition and so on and etc., and to participate in the armed struggle. And I think one of the things that the left concentrated on was this Palestine, which I mentioned in my paper, but very, very quickly, shifting to the Palestinian debate and making the debate inside the Palestinian struggle, which I think was interesting, but also, on the other hand, it was a kind of feeling that they cannot push the debate inside different countries. I mean, the question of the defeat in a country like Syria, why Syria was defeated, was not, as far as I know, was never discussed in the literary field in a serious way. Even in Egypt, where you have much more profound criticism of the regime with the novels of, as I mentioned, San'Allah, Ghalib, etc. Also, the debate was how to rejoin, because this was part of the dominant leftist ideology that we have to defend the progressive regime. This is a very problematic thing. Now, inside the Palestinian issue, where Saadallah's play is, and I think here we must read it as of course, there is something very, very powerful and very interesting in what Federica said, because there is a shift in Saadallah's playwriting, and I may say that this shift is related mainly to the situation of facing death, which will lead him to have more characters, individuals, and so on, which is very obvious in his works. But I think the sub must be put in the concept that the classical left defended from the beginning, which is searching for a common struggle between Palestinians and Jews, oppressed. In the 40s, it was working class Jewish, and it was manifested in Haifa in a very interesting way, till the history cut it down. This is a very problematic history which one must restudy, which I thought politically this is the issue. The issue is not that the Palestinians are victims, that the Israelis are victims. I don't think that in Saadallah this is the issue. In Saadallah, the issue is that the major issue is that he is representing the Israelis as humans in a very direct way, Rahil, Menuhin, and so on, which is not the first time. I mean, Kanafani did it before in Return to Haifa, Mahmoud Darwish did it all his life in Rita and so on. But it is something to be acknowledged. And it's the new thing is that you have them on theater, on the stage. You have Israeli characters on the stage, which was never done in this way before Saadallah's play. But I think the major thing is the debate between Menuhin and Saadallah. The debate will show us this project of common struggle, which is very difficult, very tough, in the words of Wannous, but which we must struggle for. And I think this idea, which we can take from the heritage of the Communist parties, is available all the time. I think we have to find a way to struggle with democratic Jews in Israel and outside Israel, and we have to push things forward and to think of the Jewish that we have now in the Arab world, an Israeli problem. Europe, Hitler made actually, unfortunately, the final solution because Europe is empty from Jews. The Jewish problem now is in the Arab world, and I think one of the problems of the Arab intellectual life is we do not think about this problem, how we have to solve this problem, and how we have to create a democratic space where a common struggle can begin against the Zionist colonial project.
Erika, would you like to?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think partly you answered already what I would also have had to say to your question. My major point here is a shift in an aesthetic shift, a new perspective in the work of Saadallah Wannous, and this is my main point here. And if I bring in a new perspective, as you said, now from nowadays, and you criticize this as a psychological and that it is connected to illness and so on and so forth, no. Psychology is not necessarily about illness, but about the individual, and individual consciousness, individual needs. And I think this is a point which, and here I would argue not only the dramas after Al-Ightisab, that they are clearly focusing on female aspects and gender aspects and so on and so forth, very individual aspects. This is clear. But I would argue that it starts already in Al-Ightisab, that Al-Ightisab is in between, what you also mentioned in your paper. There are these stereotypes, there is all this struggle and all the politics in it, but you have traces of something which starts in Al-Ightisab, which goes on further and further in the later place. And also answering to your question then from the epilogue, what about then the epilogue? Why does he give it here? It is rather unique. It is a clear advice here. It's a suggestion to something. I would give back the question to you. What would you say? Why this epilogue? What is Saadallah as a figure, as a dramatic figure here? The author's position here, and I think here is a turning point, and this was something I wanted to bring in here. And also, we will have a presentation in the second panel on the relevance of this play in the context of this so-called Arab Spring. And here a new generation is quoting Saadallah, he's very important now, and in Facebook all over you have it. Why? And I would say exactly because of this turning point. Because the generation, the new generation, it's very political, it's very committed, but there is something new which is different from the generation of the 60s. It is, we have to discuss it here. I hope we have time to do this. It might be these individual aspects play a role, karama, and really some key terms came in the hurriya. So it's, and it means individual dignity, individual human rights, and so on. So I think we have to consider this and to see also the play in this context.
Nada, would you like to also?
With respect to the rape and the presence of the author there, as you said, yes, the author is always present in any way. The thing is, how is his voice portrayed. With Al-Ightisab specifically, I think unlike, and maybe I haven't highlighted this here enough, I mean, Saadallah was present in this play. It was the last time that we see him present vividly as such. All plays in which I gave examples belong to earlier phases. But my question is, why does he have to present himself directly, not lend his voice to someone else, as he did with the Hakawati or other characters? From my observation, actually, my observation that came about from watching the play directed, it has a very strong, grueling sense. After an hour and 45 minutes, you are emotionally drained. And for an Arab, at the end of looking at this violence, whether it is violence inflicted on Palestinians or Israelis alike, it gives you a numbing feeling, okay, where you feel you are dumbfounded and have nothing more to say. Actually, when this scene ended, everybody was so silent, and they kind of realized from the lighting that the play has ended, and then you would see someone will clap, another, and then finally the whole stage was in clapping. And then, as I said, the whole space is lit together, and we are there faced. Someone says, "Where is Saadallah Wannous?" And he steps up. So for me, I felt that he really thought that the play, as it was written, might send a message, or might send might give a moral that is different from what he really intended to say. He wanted to bring back the audience attention to his counterpart, to Menuhin, to saying that, listen, you are not here looking at the Palestinians' fate or the Israelis' fate. It's actually all of us are involved in this history, and you have to get yourself out of the shock, because it is a shocking play. I mean, emotionally, I think he manages through his presence to provide emotional relief, if anything else, and redirect the question to what he really believes the object was.
Yes, I see a number of hands up. Maybe first the two ladies in the back, and then Robert. Please. Hanan.
Do I have to talk without microphone?
No, there's a micro going around. Where is it? Anyone has a micro? There was a micro. Did you have a micro, Talal? Without a micro? Somebody is running.
Meanwhile,
Thank you.
I would like to speak in Arabic because I think it's a pity to Arabophone to understand.
No, the discussion we can certainly switch back and forth.
Even for the speeches. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I will ask in Arabic, and please Nada or whoever could translate this, because you are more able to do it than me. First of all, I would like to ask Frederique, because I really I cannot recall, ما فيني اتذكر إذا الإبيلوج تغير بين النسختين اللي حكيت عنهم فريدريك. ما مغير.
Just to briefly, for those who don't understand, anyone who doesn't understand Arabic, we need to translate? Okay, so just, she was asking if the epilogue, if it's changed in the two versions, and it's not changed.
يعني هالشي شوي بلفتني، بخليني استغرب شوي، بس لما فكرت أكثر حسيت إنه الإبيلوج اللي هو شغلة متميزة وصادمة بالمسرحية، مفاجئة، بعتقد هي دعوة لأنه نرجع نخلق نحن الإبيلوج بأنفسنا. وبعتقد إنه هالحوار اللي صار بين الحكيم وبين الشخصية الافتراضية اللي هي سعدالله ونوس الشخصية الكاتب، عم يتطلع عليها سعدالله ونوس الإنسان، هو طيب وبيتأمل إنه ناس تاخد محله من بعد ما مات. يعني قصة الشخص والصورة، وصورة الصورة شغلة مهمة كتير اللي حكى عنها الياس. وبعتقد إنه هلأ إذا نحن بدنا نفرجي هالمسرحية بكل أبعادها، فينا نعملها عربية، فينا نعملها الناس اللي عم تنسجن مثلا بمصر تحت نظام السيسي، تحت نظام العسكر تماما. او انا كثير سمعت من ناس سوريين قالوا انه اللي عم بيصير بسوريا هلا ما شفناه اضرب من اللي بتعمله اسرائيل، وانا هذا الشيء بعدني لهلا برفضه، لانه بعتقد انه اسرائيل والصهاينه لخصوا وعلموا كل العالم يعني كل شيء ممكن ينعمل حتى بالخيال. صاروا الناس اللي بدهم يتسلطوا بيقدروا يتخيلوا هالشيء، بس في شيء بكلامهم حقيقي. فأنا وأنتم عم تحكوا استعرضت إنه المسرحية ممكن تكون تماماً بين ناس بعالم عربي واضح وصريح بأسماء مع ناس سجناء، ومن الجهتين في عنا الضحية والجلاد، بس طبعاً بامتداداته مع الناس، مع الجيل الأول اللي خلق الثورة، واللي هو ما خص لا الأيديولوجيين فيه ولا المنظرين ولا حدا، خلق من محل ثالث أو رابع أو خامس وصدم الكل.
Shall we very briefly just like summarize? So she was saying that the epilogue really stands out, and you pointed out in particular what Ilyas talked about, the relation of person and image and the image of the image. And you said you think that today we don't need the Israeli anymore. It would work as an Arab play, right? And it could be done, yeah. It could be done. And you gave the example of, you know, what's happening in Egypt and Syria, so that the other is kind of an inside other, if I understood you correctly. Please.
Just one remark, Hanan. Of course, you are right. We are waiting people of theater like you to do it, so just advance. The second thing, this could have been done in Arabs before the Arab Spring, which Frederica insisted to say so-called. I don't think it's so-called. It's a spring with a lot of blood, but this is how revolutions are. But this could have been done before the Arab Spring. If just we have a look on what I can call the literature of prisons in the Arabic literature. Yani Abdurrahman Munif, I have to cite 50 books. Any one of these books can be the material for a play or for a performance against oppression inside the Arab world, and oppression done by the Arab regimes against its people. But in Saud Allah's case, we are dealing with the rape, we are speaking about, I think, it's an issue inside. Israel is not the only issue. Palestine is not the only issue, I agree. But this is a major issue inside the Arab world, inside what's going on in the Arab world. And in this major issue, if we analyze how we thought about it, we will find out that there is a lot, there are nearly very rare things. And in this sense, this play is very important, because it is one of these rare things that put the struggle in its context inside Palestine and reflect on it. And I think even when we are facing with the brutality of the dictators from the Assad to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and so on and so forth, even when we have to think about the Israeli-Palestinian question, because it is very essential. Because it was, as you said, the model, and second, because it's putting forward the model of a religious state. Actually, the first religious state in the region is Israel. Of course, you can say there are two. It began with two religious states, Saudi Arabia and Israel, which I agree. But Israel, and now the struggle in Israel, if you follow what's going on in the Israeli politics, Mr. Netanyahu and the right wing are insisting on passing this law of the Jewish nature of the state. That is, if there is a Jewish state, why not Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has an Islamic state? So because this is the model, and this is beginning of the disaster. So we must not stop reflecting on it.
Rafa?
Thank you very much for this, firstly for the performance of the play on the stage, which I was very lucky to attend, and then for this scholarly works that I have just attended. Actually, my question to Dr. Frederico, I was wondering why we speak about what she called turning the victim into perpetrator. For example, when I was a kid, 1970s, and under Ba'athist regime in Iraq, we were calling those people who were killing themselves, let me say participate, in the armed struggle of the Palestinian by PLO. We used to call them fidaiyin. But we have forgotten this word, to tell you the truth. And no one mentioned it here, and I feel sorry for that. And you know, even in our English text, when I was a kid, the fidaiyin is translated into self-sacrificers. So why we don't call Talal as self-sacrificer? Why do we call her perpetrator, turning the victim into perpetrator? This is question one. Another question to Mr. Khouri and to Saud. I was wondering how Wannous uses the Arabic or his pride in the Arabic language to convey his concern about the Palestinian issue. And I want to mention something else. In Iraq, for the last decade or 11 years, from 2003, believe me, there is nothing in the that generation's minds that is called Palestine. It's completely brainwashed in our country. In my country, it was the first word we always mention before 2003. But after that, with the American invasion until now, there is nothing called Palestinian issue. And believe me, now you reminded me of it, because we are busy with other many more problems in our life. And I should like to thank you to return this issue to my mind, because I have really forgotten it. And the young generation who are now in their early 20s, they don't know anything about fidaiyin. They don't know anything about Palestine, even though we see it in the TV or in the satellite. So I want to know about the equalization, if it is correct, or if I am wrong in understanding. Why do we call the victim a perpetrator because she has participated in fidaiyin or Amaliyya Fidaiya? And how does the use of the Arabic language as a pride in his works? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I did use the word self-sacrifice to describe what Talal is doing. And of course, she's a fidaiya, of course. No matter really. But what self-sacrifice, act of these amaliyat istishhadiyya or fidaiya, this act has two sides. It's both. It's a victim who does this, and it's a perpetrator in the moment killing somebody else, structurally speaking. This is this ambiguity in the term. So you have it, and I would say this is a very crucial point, that we have both sides. We have to deal with it philosophically and individually and psychologically. And this is also, I would say, why I personally brought in this Fanon-Sartre issue, because how legitimate is it for the person? What about the person who does such an act? What happens to the person doing acting as somebody who acts out violence, him or herself? What does it do to the personality? We have to cope with this, and if in which way? This was my point, that we have both of these sides in.
First, about the pride of the language, I think they write in Arabic, there's nothing to be proud about. This is our language. The only thing is we have to use it all the time, and you have to develop it. And I think this is what Saud did, and many other writers did. The role of the writer is to reinvent the language, and I think the language of Saud is, as I said in my presentation, is fascinating in this simplicity which makes you feel that you are not reading classical Arabic, although it's very classical. Now, to go back to this idea of fida'i, you are right, but the fida'i, there are two problems. We have to differentiate between the fida'i and the istishhadi. These are two concepts, Federica, we cannot put together. The concept of the fida'i, you die while you are defending the people. So you die, you can die. You fight, or while you are defending the people, and that moment you can die and you can kill. But you kill as a fida'i, that is, you kill as someone defending. You kill as someone being attacked. And the concept of the fida'i disappeared even in Arabic. And this is not Frederica's problem, it's our problem. Because the new Islamic discourse that dominated after the Fidaiyin stopped to be Fidaiyin. I will not ask why the Islamists are on the stage without asking why the Fidaiyin left the stage and became, if we take the PA, for example, the Palestinian Authority became a kind of collaborators. So first of all, we have to bring back the term Fida'i so that the discussion will work. In this sense, Talal was a Fida'iyya. She was not a terrorist. No, not a terrorist at all. Not a terrorist, and I refuse to use this term when you speak about the struggle of an oppressed people. This is, Hamas are not terrorists. I don't agree with their ideology, but this is not terrorism. Mm-hmm. This is resistance. I don't like this type of resistance, I would have preferred another type. Okay, but we have to use adequate terms, otherwise we'll fall in the trap of the dominant Americanized postmodern language, which makes everything like everything. Mm-hmm. The second thing, Frederic, this use of Camus-Sartre debate is very misleading. Wannous cannot be in that. Cannot at all. In this debate, which is part of a debate of a special French debate between two tendencies in the essentialist movement, one which is leftist and the other which is rightist, and we have to say things like they are. Camus, who declared that he will choose his mother. You remember his famous sentence when he was asked, if I have to choose between my mother and justice, I'll choose my mother. Let him go to his mother and leave us. I mean, to put a question like that, if I have to choose, the question is false. Choosing between your mother and justice. The question is false unless you are part of the colons and you accept the system of the colons. Then, of course, then you have to choose your mother and go to hell with your mother, and actually the Algerians send them to hell, both of them. Now, so to put Wannous here, I don't think it works at all. This is a debate. Wannous was a Marxist, and he continued to be a Marxist even when he began in the late. Communist? Marxist. He was first. You said communist. No. First, he was member of the Communist Party. Everybody knows that. Yeah. Nobody, and he never تبرع. He never. He was an authentic man. Mm-hmm. He was a member of the Communist Party. And he continued to be very near. If he was no more, I think this is what the case was, he was no more a militant in the Communist Party, but he continued to be very near to the communist movement. Now, with all the problematics of the communist movement in Syria, because you know the Communist Party in Syria became 2, 3, 4 parties, I don't know how much, and with different perspectives, and Wannous tried to continue to be as Marxist-Leninist, as Marxist as he can, as one can. So in the debate, in the rape, this is a debate about the destiny of Palestine and about how we conceive the Jews of Palestine, which is part of the debate inside the Arab and Palestinian left. It's not a philosophical debate related to an existentialist problematic of Albert Camus. It's something very political, very direct, related to how we will deal with the Jewish minority in the region. Because our cousins will be very, very, very upset when they will hear this term, which is the real term. We have a Jewish minority in the region, and we have to find ways to deal with this minority with all respect and with all acceptance, but with a refusal of the colonial project.
Thank you. We have one more question, maybe two. We can maybe get them together, and then, so Robert Myers and Edward Seater, two questions, and then responses, and then afterwards we continue the discussion during the lunch break. Please do stay with us. We have a lunch break afterwards over here, and we will move some of the discussion over there. Please, Robert.
Thank you. It's a really wonderful discussion. I wonder if we could, in fact, I thought Frederica's talk was an interesting opening, even though Elias seems clearly not to think that it applies directly with Camus and Sartre. What I'm particularly interested in is the playwright as public intellectual. And I would say, for example, that Wannous's epilogue here, for any theater scholar, immediately evokes the end of Doll's House, where you think the play is essentially over and a discussion takes place. And Shaw, who saw the play first brought over by Karl Marx's daughter to the UK, said that this cracked the code of the modern theater in which you could begin to have discussion. And then when Eric Bentley writes his book in the 40s, The Playwright as Thinker, he traces a whole genealogy, Ibsen, Shaw, Strindberg, Brecht, of course, is his hero. And then there are a range of post-Brechtians, Soyinka, Boal, Fugard, and Wannous is one of those too. So whatever one thinks of this discussion, and again, I would remind myself and others that both Camus and Saud are philosophers in their writing, in their plays, in their novels. And I thought when Elias made this point that the writer and his or her double, the idea that the words are the manifestation of the writer, that is the ultimate message, that there is not this meta discourse outside, which is an ideological discourse, a political discourse, an anti-colonial discourse, that's the real discourse, whereas what's taking place on the stage or in the text is sort of ancillary to some sort of larger discourse. So since there are these other exemplars, Soyinka, Boal, and et cetera, that I've named, I'd love to see a discussion of Wannous within that, and that might also bring Sonia into the conversation too, as this very, very, very important world figure. It's a long-winded question. Thank you.
Thank you. Ted, would you like to add your question? Okay, great.
Sonia, you ask you. Go ahead.
Sorry. I need to refocus. Sorry, I wasn't following the very last pass. I was already concerned with the lunch break. No. So, let me see. So, you were thinking how to contextualize Wannous more within the context of world theater? And that.
Mississippi or Wannous writes about Syria and the Arab world in Arabic, right? Nonetheless, I think that to simply put him within that framework is one that he would reject.
Yes.
This is part of being a communist, is being an internationalist, and therefore I'd love to see him, at least you, to discuss him side by side, even if he wasn't acknowledged as Shoyinka was, with the Nobel Prize, perhaps because they gave it to Naguib Mahfouz shortly before Wannous' death, or if he'd lived a little longer, then we'd go, he's a universal writer. We wouldn't be talking about him as simply, which is not to be reductionist. I'm simply saying that, these issues were being dealt with by other writers in other contexts, and he was well aware of them, and clearly was a cultural critic. And
I certainly agree with that, and I think it's helpful to look at Wannous in the, closer, if you want, political context of the Arab world and, the Palestinian question in particular, or the Jewish question, as Elias put it. I think it is very important to, look at him in this broader context, and I think this is really also, your contribution was taking his place, abroad, right? And this is why I was actually very happy that Friederike brought in the discussion of violence, right? Where I think this is where we can really also link that to really broader issues. You want to jump in?
Just also we have to remind that what you said, that this was in the first moment a kind of adaptation of a Spanish play. So the international context was already in, and as I already mentioned in the beginning of my paper, that as far as I understood Saud Wannous, his orientation and self-understanding was always as being a part of an international, so artists, not movement, but community, and so it's very clearly here, and therefore I had the idea to bring in these Fanon, Sartre, Camus debate, not to say that it is the same kind of conflict here. I wanted to provoke a little bit, and I realized it worked very well, because I wanted to get here for a publication I wouldn't dare before, because of course for the political context and the internal Arab, of course you have to have a very close look and to have the political context. I'm very grateful that you mentioned this context. Of course we have this, but on the other side we have this kind of universal and philosophical, philosophical question, what is violence, and so on and so forth. So, and I would argue that Saud Wannous had these philosophical issues in his mind, and so we have to bring it up here in a discussion.
But I would like to also to add that the local here, I think, and here Wannous is really typical, if you want, for his generation, and really standing out for his generation, that his emphasis on the local also makes him stand out then internationally, that he's really bringing something new and something, special to world theater, right? So it's not just following, outside models, but he's also, this focus on the local allows him really to make a real contribution, right? So thank you very much. We'll continue the discussion in the lunch break. Please do join us. And then we start with our second panel at 2 o'clock.
Lunch break, we have lunch.
We have the lunch break right here in the foyer.